So the theme for today is a theme that is near and dear to my heart. It is pleasure in personal and spiritual development. I think it's something that's for me is very important to talk about. As some of you know, I learned a lot of the essence work working with Faisal Mukaddam, who was one of the co-founders of the Ridwan school, and I have worked very little with Almas, so most of what I know about the Ridwan school comes from all the people from the Ridwan school who have joined my courses, and then they make the comparisons. And I think it's interesting because the impression that I have got is that with the diamond approach, the idea is let's look at the issues and really work with the issues, and then by working with all the issues, we'll eventually get to essence. And Faisal has a very different approach. He says, let's go and tune into the essence, right? Straight off the bat, first thing we do in a workshop, and this is the approach that I have adopted as well. Let's just go straight, tune into the essence, hang out with it as much as we can, talk about it, invoke it, sense it, and so on. And then people are going to freak out, and then we don't need to speculate about what their issues with the essence are, because it gets triggered by the experience of the essence. So that's the one way and the other. I remember once Faisal's explanation of the difference between the two schools is that Almas is a 5 and he's a 4. And it sounds compelling to me. I can buy that explanation. So yes, but I've always really loved the Faisal's approach. I really find it amazing, and one of the things I find amazing about it is that it puts, in a sense you can say it puts pleasurable experiences front and center in personal development. And I think this is it. I think it's becoming more usual, but I think it isn't still particularly usual. So when you look at spiritual and personal development, you kind of see two big categories. So one of the categories of personal and spiritual practices is, of course, meditation and yoga nidra and these kind of things. And in a sense, you can say that is... when we talk about those practices, we also talk about pleasure, right? It can be very enjoyable to meditate. So sit down and just feeling soothed, taking a break from everything, feeling consciously relaxing your body can be very pleasurable. So there are these kind of practices that does put pleasure front and center. But then there's a lot of other practices, especially when we go to the more therapeutic side of things. And I think a lot of people have this idea that when you think about self-development, and especially when you think about the more therapeutic part of self-development, I think many people think about it as a painful process with a pleasurable goal, right? It's something like first you face your demons, first you see some hard truths about yourself, and then you're rewarded by having a better life with more confidence or kindness or better relationships or better capacity to enjoy things in life and so on. So I think many people, there is this idea that you go through something painful to get to the pleasurable thing. And of course, there is some truth in that. It can be, if you are carrying painful emotions or painful experiences, there is something, you sometimes you need to brace yourself a little bit, and in order to acknowledge those things, or expose those things, or something like that. And sometimes in therapy also you do recognize things about yourself which doesn't maybe make you feel very proud. It causes chinks in your self-image, right? And it can be uncomfortable. So there is a certain level of discomfort, but doing it can be a huge relief, because often we think, if we don't keep this deep dark thing secret from everybody else, the world will collapse. But then we expose it, and the world doesn't collapse, and we go, we breathe a sigh of relief, right? So there is something about this idea that you sometimes go through something uncomfortable, maybe even painful, and then there is something very relieving about that. It's the same sometimes when you connect to trauma. The first encounter is not gonna be pleasant, but if you don't connect with it, it's very difficult for it to heal, and if it doesn't heal, then it will keep having a negative impact on your life. So there is something to say for that perspective, that we go through something difficult, something painful, and then that's the path to relief and pleasure and these kind of things, increased capacity for enjoyment. However, I think it's important to see that this is at best half the story. So there are a lot of problems with this way of thinking. So there are a lot of problems with the perspective that personal development is going through something tough and painful, and then being rewarded with something pleasurable. And I think I'll mention three things. So the first thing is the expectation of the personal and spiritual development being something painful can make us avoid or delay the process altogether. So I don't know how you ever experienced this thing. You're about to get a therapy session, and you go, oh, do I really have the energy for this today, right? How many have? Is it just me? Oh, okay, yeah. And sometimes that makes us postpone the personal development. And this is, of course, problematic, right? Because we're not moving as fast as we could. And this is because of this perspective that it's necessarily painful. Another thing is that the expectation of pain can make us subtly avoid the process, or by keep going back to the painful bits that we have already processed, as a way to avoid the painful bits that we don't want to go to. Many times I have seen this in workshops and with clients, how there's an expectation that you need to reveal something about yourself, but then people reveal the same things over and over and over again. And then you say, I think this self-disclosure is actually a way of keeping something hidden. Right? So I always have that question when I hear the same thing exposed over and over again. It's like, I do this and I'm not proud of it. And I think, yeah, but you have revealed that the last 5 times we spoke together. And then my question is like, what is this self-disclosure helping you to hide in this moment? Right? Then I get curious. So sometimes this can be... the idea that it has to be painful can make you engage in that kind of funny ways of hiding things. And then there's another way of looking at it. So the idea of that we go through pain to something pleasurable. If you have experienced a couple of times that when you reveal something painful about yourself, when you touch into a traumatic experience and acknowledge it and talk about it, then you go through it and you come to a place of great relief, great enjoyment, something very pleasurable. sometimes what happens is that then you develop the idea, in order to get to the pleasurable space, you have to go through the pain, and that means now you don't want to let go of the pain. Because if you lost the pain, you would no longer have the doorway to the pleasure, right? And so this is very interesting, because it's like the work we do is to dissolve the trauma or dissolve the painful places. But if they become your only connection to something bigger, to something pleasurable, then part of you is going to go like, no way, I'm not going to let go of this. And that becomes a funny double bind, right? If you don't let go of it, it's going to have a negative impact on your life. But if you do let go of it, then you lose the possibility of getting to where you want to go. I mean, you don't, but your experience seemed to suggest that. And so many times I have seen this when I've been working with people, this development of an attachment to the difficult places. And it's always fun the first time somebody comes to a session and say, actually, sometimes people are almost a little bit apologetic, because they say, actually, I don't have anything difficult to talk about today. So should we cancel the session, right? And I always say, no, let's talk about where you are, because, you're here. And then we talk about, well, we can't talk about anything that's difficult because nothing difficult is going on for the person. But then we talk about something that is not difficult. And often that will also unpack great insights and lead to an expansion of awareness and sometimes increased pleasure. And so I think that is often a big eye-opener when that happens, because it reveals, actually, you can work with yourself without touching into something negative or difficult. Not to say that so now you never have to touch into something difficult. Of course you do. But it's not a necessity. And I think this is really important. So this is some of the problems I see with thinking that, with having this mindset that personal and spiritual development is about going through the difficult spots in order to experience the relief. And that is that it creates a certain attachment to the difficult spots, which means that you can only progress so far. I like in Buddhism, they talk about the teaching being like a raft. And I like this image. They say it's like a raft. You get on it, you cross the river. Once you cross the river, you leave the raft. No reason to take it on your back and carrying it with you. And in the same way, touching into difficult spaces is crucial. It's key for personal and spiritual development. I have never seen anybody getting far without doing it. But at some point, it's a good idea to say, well, okay, it was a vehicle, it got me somewhere, and now I'm somewhere else, and maybe I don't need to carry that vehicle with me. So I think that's very important. So you can say, in certain traditions, they talk about two forms of meditation, samatha and vipassana. And so translated, that would be, they have some practices that are soothing and calming practices, focusing on serenity, calmness. And then there's other practices that focuses on gaining insight, right? Upgrading your perspectives and your views on life, because you have a lot of ideas about life that's just plainly wrong, and that causes you a lot of problems. But I really like it to see that personal and spiritual development, there are these two sides to it. There's the calming bit and there's the insight bit. And sometimes the insights are a little difficult to, take in, but the calming is very pleasant, very nice. And I think if you only do one, then if you, for example, only focus on the pleasure, right, it becomes hedonism. You might get stuck in that way. If you only focus on the, like, let's just get the insights and see all the ways that we perceive things in the wrong ways and all these things, then I think you also get stuck. And some people who have been writing about these two sides, they say, well, actually, they're not really two separate things. Most practices that are really effective will have elements of both. They might have different blends of it, but they contain both aspects. And in a sense, you can see the two as two sides of the same coin. And I really like this way of thinking. So it's like in personal and spiritual development, it's not pleasure and insight are mutually supportive. So it's not only that when you gain insight into yourself, into the nature of reality, that can increase or bring about great joy, pleasure. It's also that pleasure, joy, calmness, these kind of things can make it much easier to get insight. And this is why some people say the two are actually just two sides of the same coin. So I think it's pretty easy to I think everybody is on board with how facing hard truths and facing demons, and also on a more metaphysical level, understanding more about the nature of reality. So looking into like in Mahayana Buddhism, when they talk about realizing the absence of inherent existence in all phenomena, including the self, these kind of things are crucial. They're key. And they can lead to a great sense of freedom, right? We say they lead to liberation. And we say they need to I like in when we talk about nirvana, right? It's like you're blown out and you're freed from something. And when we talk about what is they call moksha, right? The moksha translates into something like it. In a sense, it's another word for the same state, but the two words emphasize different things. When nirvana emphasizes the freedom of it, moksha emphasizes the sweetness and the pleasure of it, right? So moksha, I think it translates to bliss or something like this. So it's interesting to see. For today, I think I want to talk a little bit about how exactly does pleasure lead to insights, right? How does sweetness and bliss and calmness and serenity, why does that make it more easy for us to see ourselves clearly, to see the world clearly, to embrace the kind of truths that we might otherwise not embrace? And I think there's a couple of answers for this. First of all, when you feel calm, when you feel pleasure, that calms down a lot of parts of you. So you have a lot of parts of you that might be defensive parts. Maybe you have parts that feel deprived. Maybe you have anxious parts. When you have a sense of pleasure, all of these parts calm down. So for example, if you can think about it, if you feel really good one day, right? I don't know, you had a good night's sleep, something, you just feel good that day. Maybe you just came out of a meditation and somebody's criticizing you. And you go like, fair point. They have a fair point, right? You feel good, so it doesn't hit you so much. It's like the pleasure is like a bit of a cushion. And so you're more, well, I already feel good. So it's okay to acknowledge, like, do I have flaws? Yes, I do. I'm human, right? So of course I have flaws, like everybody. And having those pointed out to you on the days that you feel really good is much easier than having those pointed out to you when you feel under pressure, you feel stressed, and so on. So this is one reason why actively cultivating your capacity for feeling pleasure is contributes greatly to your personal and spiritual development. Another reason practicing pleasure and your capacity to abide in pleasure contributes greatly to your personal and spiritual development is that it very directly reveals certain insights to you. For example, it reveals something very fundamental about the nature of reality. Most people think we have to do something in order to feel good, right? We have to change ourselves, change our environment, change our work, change our partner. We have to do something to feel good. When you experience, for example, in meditation, that you can sit down, nothing in your life changes. You just sit down, you close your eyes, focus on your breathing or whatever it is you like to do when you meditate, and you feel amazing. It reveals to you that there's something fishy about this idea of good feelings necessarily coming from you changing something, because you can sit down and nothing changes and you feel amazing. I remember once a friend of mine, or an acquaintance of mine from my childhood. I hadn't seen her for many years, and she had been feeling some stress due to different life circumstances, and she had picked up meditation. Basically, she had just put a chair in her attic, I think, and sometimes she would go and sit in the chair for some minutes and do nothing. And then she experienced that she would go there and she would feel absolutely amazing. And she was like, how is this possible? This makes no sense. And then she spoke to a mutual friend of ours, and he said, well, why don't you talk to Claus? He seems to know something about these things, right? And it was amazing to hear how she just stumbled upon this truth that the things that we seek are already here, available to us. All we need to do is calm down sufficiently to notice them, right? And she could calm down by going to her chair and sitting in the chair and relaxing, and then all of a sudden, her mind lets go of all the stuff it's busy with, and she's like, oh, hang on a sec, the present moment feels amazing. And this is an example of where if you have a practice that's only about soothing yourself and calming yourself down, it leads directly to a very profound insight about the nature of reality. I think another example of how soothing practices that focus on increasing your capacity to abide in pleasure, how that can lead to insights, is that when you soothe yourself, when you calm down, you suddenly gain access to what you could call the big mind. And it's like suddenly you don't just see things clearer, you also get this multifaceted, three-dimensional kind of view. It's like literally like your perspective opens up, and you see a lot of things that were just not visible to you before. You know this from when you have an argument with your partner or something like that, right? When you're really stressed out, you just see your perspective and you don't get why they don't see your perspective, because it's so obviously true. And their perspective is, you see all the flaws in their logic, right? And why don't they see it? And it's like, And then later, maybe you calm down, something nice happens, you're less stressed, and you go, actually, there are flaws in the logic, but they also have a point, right? I understand what they're trying to say, and it's actually something that would be good to include in my own way of looking at things, right? It's like I had tunnel vision, and they're saying something, they're pointing to something that's outside the tunnel vision, but which is valid and important. And now we can have a real dialogue. So There's something about when you calm down, your perception opens up. And I think this is very understandable, because if you're in pain, it can be emotional pain, it can be whatever kind of pain. If you're in some sort of pain or something you perceive as painful, the natural thing that happens is that it will trigger automatic responses that seeks to remedy the situation. And these automatic responses, they consist of a particular perspective, which sort of instructs us to pay attention to these two things, because they are the important things to pay attention to. And as we pay attention to those two things, it's going to make certain behavioral patterns obvious to us, so it makes us engage in certain behaviors, and it's going to create certain emotions, and the behavioral and emotional patterns that are triggered by the perspective will reinforce the perspective and make the perspective look as, yeah, that's the right way of looking at things, right? So you can say, for example, let's say if somebody rejects you, right? And the rejection, you feel that as a form of pain. And then maybe that triggers the automatic response to protect you against that pain. You will counter reject, right? So you will take a perspective that says, well, that person that rejects me doesn't really know what they're talking about. Look at all their flaws. And if you say the other person's flaws, that's what's important to pay attention to, right? That's the perspective you take. It will lead you to push the other person away, and it will lead you to feel a certain amount of anger. And the emotion of anger and the action of pushing the other person away will reinforce the perspective that there's something wrong with that person. And so you now have this nice, cozy little self-fulfilling bubble, right? You're caught in this bubble of mutually supportive perspectives, emotions, and actions. And it closes. You can see how that closes your perspective. And it can be very difficult to get out of those perspectives once you're caught in them, because what's going to bring you out of them? Any information that could show your narrow vision is filtered out from the outset, because it's probably outside what you pay attention to, because it doesn't seem to be something important. So it can be very difficult. If you look at the Enneagram, then the 9 different types of the Enneagram are wonderful descriptions of 9 different bubbles that we can get caught in, right? Take Enneagram 2. The important thing is that other people like me. That's what I pay attention to. What do I then do? I start noticing what people like, and then I try to fashion myself into that as a way of avoiding other people's rejection. Cool. And I feel a fear of rejection, and all of this is gonna then enclose me and into that perspective, right? Being accepted by other people, being liked by other people, that's the important thing. And one of the things that we don't see is when you fashion yourself into what other people like, you are rejecting yourself, and that creates that sense of rejection that you are fighting. And so it's very counterproductive what you're doing, but you don't see it because the mind is closed down. When we focus on feeling good, right? When we focus on soothing ourselves, maybe as a tool, if we focus on feeling the sweetness, feeling the love, feeling that wonderful sense of connection that we're ultimately after, right? That just sweet, yummy connectedness. When you feel that, it's like the parts of you that are occupied with, that's anxious and worried about other people's rejection, calms down. And it's much easier to see, well, actually, what is it I'm doing with this trying to be likable, right? So when you have the thing that you're after, whether it's settledness or sweetness or aliveness or peace and serenity, when you have the thing that you're after, it's much easier to gain insight into the flawed nature of your strategies for attaining those things. And this is why the practices that enables you to just hang out with those calming states, the sweetness, the groundedness, the peacefulness, the serenity, opens your mind, gives you access to a broader perspective, and really enhances your capacity to gain self-insight, insight into how you work, and insight into the patterns in you that are counterproductive. So this is another important way in which soothing practices, pleasurable practices, really enhances your capacity to gain insight. Yes, I think that's sort of like what I had prepared. So maybe I'm curious. Any questions at this point? No, I think it's interesting, right? And I think many times it's like something like just sitting. It's again, it our approach to it can be different. Some people will say just sitting. Oh gosh, and finally, right? I just get to sit. What a delight! And sometimes you say just sitting. Oh, another chore, right? I already did the dishes and washed the clothes, and now I have to do my sitting, right? And of course, that's hugely important. The it's almost like two completely different practices. You might be doing the same thing physically, but of course, it's two completely different practices depending on your attitude towards sitting. I think with many practices, sitting meditation, yoga practices, and so on, again, I think in order to make your practice more pleasurable, it's really important where you have your intention while you're practicing. Like, for example, in sitting meditation, maybe you notice the hum in the body that emerges while you're sitting, and you find that delicious, right? And so if you find something that seems delicious, of course it's much easier to sit. I remember one of my teachers once said, if you engage in a practice where you want your attention to go inward, like for example in meditation or in yoga, it's important that you deliberately pay attention to something that's pleasurable. And he gave a very interesting metaphor. He said it's a little bit like, what is it that keeps all the bees coming back to the beehive, right? That's the queen bee. And so you have to find your queen bee, because that sense of internal pleasure. It's like your attention, that's the bees, right? Your attention is out here all over the place. But if you have that queen bee, that's something pleasurable inside, they will keep coming back. They'll get drawn in. And I think this is really important for whatever practice you have, that you identify that something pleasurable that by its very nature will draw your attention back in. There's something very true in this, right? Practice shouldn't be forced, of course not. And it's kind of a debate. It's an ongoing debate, because it's like sometimes we have automatic processes that scatter us, but we're very enthusiastic about them. And so it is beneficial to disengage from those processes. And initially, we might need to apply a little bit of force to do that. But of course, if we keep forcing ourselves, we should look at our practice and go like, there's something fishy about this. But sometimes in order to, it's you all in spiritual and personal development, you have this, many people say, it's about this radical surrender, right? Just surrender. But many times if we try to surrender, we just surrender to all our compulsions. And when in fact it would be much more beneficial to surrender our compulsions. So sometimes we need to put a little bit of a break on our compulsions. We need to do a little bit of energy, put in a little bit of energy to say no to the compulsions. And is it force? Maybe not, but there's an element of it. So yeah, I was thinking about the revolting, sitting, etc. Yes, I mean, of course, I don't know if I understand exactly what you mean, but of course, it's like when you see people who do sitting meditation and they loathe it, right, but they force themselves to it day in, day out, year in, year out. You go like, this is not a good approach to practicing. And exactly like you're right, there's you are not listening to yourself when you do that. Yes, exactly. You just make it worse for yourself. It's like your practice become your compulsion, right? So it's your practice becomes basically the thing that you should let go of, yeah. And sometimes I also give that advice to people: just stop meditating. You get much more out of that. Free yourself of the burden of the practice. At one point, I was a workshop with Claudio Naranjo, like a retreat with Claudio Naranjo. And he did this thing, like sometimes he would invite teachers that he liked, and he would do the mornings, they would do the afternoon, and then in the end they would do some sessions together. And he comes very much from a Mahayana background, or came from a Mahayana background. And the teacher he invited came from a Dakshin background, right? And Dakshin, they're famous for saying like that they are the fastest way to enlightenment, because the only thing that you have to do is realize you're already enlightened. And then Claudio, like in his cheeky way, goes like, this is absolutely true. But it does seem to me that it takes an awful long time to prepare them to have that insight. To prepare them for the path. So yeah, I think it's that is the paradox.